So you angered all the gods, yes, all of them, from every mythology, from Greek to Aztec, and now you have to fight off their armies. That's the basic concept behind my new game, Project Myth. It's an action platformer roguelike where you battle through waves of enemies as quickly as you can, and then at the end of each stage, you face a mythological deity in a boss fight. The game that I was last working on was Project Seaborn, which is an action RPG, and while I had made a lot of progress with it, it was just too large in scope, at least for now, so I'm putting it on hold while I make this game. And one of the main goals I have for Project Myth is making very fun core gameplay as quickly as possible. I want the moment-to-moment gameplay to be very fun before I even begin to think about adding any extra systems in. And I want to have this game on Steam within 100 days. So in this video, I'm covering the first 25 days of development. So if you want to follow the rest of this game's development, then be sure to subscribe. But okay, thanks for watching, it's time to dive into development. For the first day, I started off with the most important part of a platformer, movement. It's very important to get it to feel just right, so I buckled down, put on my programming hat, and downloaded TerraDev's 2D platformer controller. Yeah, I mean, why reinvent the wheel? TerraDev has put a lot of time into building a controller that feels fantastic and also works on any slope angles. Plus it has options for double jumping, wall climbing and jumping, ladder climbing, and dashing. So I cut down the controller a bit, as I only wanted to keep a few of these options that I really want in the game, dashing and wall jumping. And seriously, this controller feels fantastic. The sound effects are a bit weird, as its landing and jumping sounds make the character sound really soggy for some reason, but I can change that in the future. So I just finished up by making a Trello board to organize my tasks, and also adding source control through Plastic SCM. You should always use source control. And day 2, it's now time to add the second part of the title, attacking. You can attack up, down, left, and right. And I went ahead and added a bunch of elements of game feel to attacking to start with, like screen shake, freeze frame, and particles. Plus I made it so that you can bounce off enemies and also added knockback for both enemies and the player. I made a lot of these effects by using the feel asset that I got through the Unity asset store. And on the third day, I decided to focus on choosing what the art style for the game should be. And I decided to pretty much bring back the simple color, thick outline art style from a previous Siam game that I was making, Inferno Vader. This art style is really easy to make, and I think that it gives the game a memorable and chunky style, allowing me to really emphasize important elements. And on day 4, I added health bars and some particles for enemies taking damage. I'm zooming through all these features right now, in large part because I'm bringing features directly from Project Seaborn's code. These health bars have tweening and stuff because I already made that. I'm also bringing over the instance controller system for taking damage and projectiles and stuff from Project Seaborn. So a lot of those annoying basic things are already finished. But to finish out the day, I also started working on making walking enemy movements, and in going into the next day, it turns out that this is actually kinda hard. I want to have enemies accelerate in whatever direction they're going. So I add their acceleration each frame and then cap it. But then I also want to do things like knockback and gravity, which I don't want to be capped. So after a while, I eventually decided to simply turn off gravity, and set the velocity directly in code, doing all the movement, gravity, and knockback myself instead of using Unity's built-in systems for these forces. And it took a while to get it feeling solid, but it's good now. And on the next day, I spent some more time on art, making the basic running enemy into a goblin who has animations and stuff. Plus I made it possible for enemies to jump. They do this when moving into a wall, and also whenever there's a hole in front of them and the player is above them. It's a very simple system, and they won't be able to navigate through every circumstance, but they'll figure most of these stages out with just these 2 rules. On day 7, I added a bit more polish to taking damage for the player. Before, while you'd be invincible for a few moments after getting hurt, you could still get trapped in big groups of enemies. So I decided to also turn off collision with enemies for this invincible time, so that you can just go through them to escape and damage boost. Now it's time for some very basic level design. I'm just throwing together 2 stages. A basic level for you to battle on and a different stage for the library. In between waves, you'll go back to the library and there you can buy items to upgrade. Oh yeah, you might be wondering, why is it a library? Well, it's time for some deep lore. Why are all these gods attacking you? Well, that's because you're playing as a famous writer of mythology. Some of the ones I plan on including are Homer and Snorri Sturluson. And you just accidentally discovered secrets behind every god that they don't want you to know about. So these gods are going to keep sending armies until they wipe you out. And this is a roguelike, so in the end you do end up dying. And that's why we don't know about these secrets in our modern times, as you got killed before you can reveal them. So that's the basic outline for the sort of story I want, nothing very serious. I then added some more polish to combat, adding a death effect where an impact circle appears and the enemy's corpse goes flying and then explodes into some blood. It's less gory than it sounds. Then I started on enemy attacks, and this is also a system that I'm mostly moving over from Project Seaborn. And the first attacking enemy that I'll be adding is the Centaur. He'll be another ground up enemy who shoots arcing projectiles, so I brought over all the scripts for enemy attacking, as well as the scriptable object for holding the type of attack, and the projectile behavior script. But I need to set up a way for it to shoot projectiles at the player of the arc. which is easier said than done. If I use the in-engine gravity, then I'll have to do some physics in order to calculate the angle at which I shoot the arrow, and that's a bit too much for me right now. So I came up with a cheat. I added a simple animation curve that gets added to the bullet's height, so at the start of the arc it has 0 extra height, in the middle it has 1, and at the end it's back to 0, so it'll arc. And I continue to work on this into the next day as it's actually pretty complicated, and into the next day. It's pretty difficult to make the arc a normal, consistent height, and I was also pretty busy on these days. But on day 10, I finally figured it out. Before, I'd been shooting the arrow with a consistent speed, and then estimating the time that it would take to hit the player at that speed, then moving the bullet around that arc, making the arc super high when far away and really low and fast when close. So I instead switched it so that the arrow will always have a consistent time that it takes to reach the player, so that it shoots slower whenever close and faster whenever further away, like a real arrow that actually obeys some laws of physics. So now it actually always arcs in the same height. This fixed things, and I polished it up by adding some more anticipation to its shooting animation. One issue that I was running into now that I have 2 different types of enemies is that they tend to get stuck on each other. The centaur doesn't want to move towards the player, while the goblin always does. And this works fine when they're just one or the other, but the goblin pushes the centaur around otherwise, which I don't want. But I don't want to make it so the enemies just don't collide with each other, because then they'll just kind of merge together into one big enemy, which isn't what I want. So I instead made it so that only melee enemies can collide with each other and only ranged enemies can collide with each other, which works way more smoothly. And on the next day, I added some money pickups. They are pooled and they pop out of enemies on deaths, and they also get sucked up by the player, who mixes a particle on collection. And the next day, I made an enemy spawning system. I just set up a bunch of locations on the stage where enemies could spawn, as I figured this would allow me to place the enemies in interesting positions, including sometimes stacked on each other. The ways the enemies spawn is a point system. Different enemies are worth different points, with the goblins being a standard 1, while the centaurs are worth 3, and there are a set number of points that are subtracted from with each spawn until there are no points left. This is very basic and I'll probably improve it in the future. I then set up a door which you can interact with whenever there are no enemies left standing to go back to the library. And then I switched the game over to multi-scene editing, which meant that I can split the player and the game levels into 2 different scenes, and keep the player while changing between the level scenes, and this is just a much smarter way of setting up the game. And finally, I made a second battle scene. On day 13, I cleaned up my process for making levels, and I also made the centaur no longer walk off edges, so he'll keep any high positions that he spawns with. And then I struggled with Text Mesh Pro for like an hour. I simply cannot make a good pixel-perfect outline with the text in Unity. I've tried shaders, I've tried everything. Why is it impossible? If anybody knows how to make this work, then it would really be appreciated. But now it's time to make some more of the core systems for the game. These will be healing, shops, and items. Healing is pretty simple. You'll just have flasks, because everything is a Dark Souls knockoff nowadays, and you'll just have to stand still and hold F to use it. Then there's a shop where you can buy flasks and items, and it's super simple. So, items. Items are very complicated. I want stackable items in the game that can do pretty much anything. But starting out, I think the main things they should be able to affect are stats like damage and defense, but also double jumps and crit chance, status effects, which it should be able to inflict, and these status effects will also be able to affect stats, and the items should finally be able to instantiate something and pull these things. So that's like 4 different systems already, so that's a lot to do. So on day 14, I started off by making an item manager to hold the items, with an item scriptable object to hold item values, and a stat system with modifiers. Well, actually, I didn't make the stat system. I used this GitHub stat system that is designed to work with modifiers, which can be linear, additive, or multiplicative, which is a huge time save. So I made the stat system work with items. Basically, items have an effect, and that effect can trigger a bunch of different events, including on whenever you get the item, whenever you kill an enemy, whenever you damage an enemy, whenever you take damage, and more. And I set up the effect to work with the stat system. So on day 15, I made some items using this new system. They're all really simple, as all they can do is change your stats. So they do things like increasing your damage, giving you a second jump, increasing your critical hit chance, and your critical hit damage. And they also all stack. I fixed the money pickups as well, and I made them just go through walls whenever they are being sucked up. Finally, I added an off-screen enemy indicator, so you can always tell where they are hiding. And on the next day, I added some more items and stats, and then I also made item rarity work. And I also added specific drop tables and chances to chests. For a default chest, there's a 79% chance of a common, a 20% chance of a rare, and a 1% chance of a legendary. Or as I'm calling it in my game, a godly. Because you know, myths. On day 17, I added even more game juice to the game, adding some freeze frames to taking damage, more particles, and more sound effects, including a nice one for picking up money. I also added this cool, pretty over-the-top effect for healing, and I added controller rumble for some actions. But on day 18, I added even more particle effects, including some directional blood whenever you hurt enemies, and some perpendicular white particles that come out as well. I finished by setting up the architecture that handled multiple player weapons in the future for different characters, and starting with the next day, I began to add more functionality to items, starting with spawning things. This was the simplest sort of item effect to set up, as I just had to spawn in the object, and it also made it possible to use a pool with doing that. And then I just set up the object with a few values. And I tested this out with an explosion that spawned whenever you kill an enemy, and it's really just a circle right now. But on day 20, I further improved the centaur shooting animation, making the arrow flash before firing. I also cleaned up a lot of the code in the backgrounds, and now it's time for a new enemy, a flying one. So far, the two enemies have been pretty basic creatures from mythology: goblins from Northern European folklore, and centaurs from Greek mythology. And so for the next one, I'm drawing from Japanese folklore, a yokai called the Nobusuma, a blood-sucking bat. It doesn't seem to have a super consistent design, so I'm just gonna make it a goofy little guy. And the next day, I started on its movement. I just imported A-Star Pathfinding project and tried to use the code that I used to have for Project Seaborn's enemy movement. But I realized that Project Seaborn's enemy movement just doesn't work. Yeah, I actually messed it up at some point, and the pathfinding doesn't actually work. It just goes straight at the player. Somehow, I just didn't realize it. Whoops. But I fixed that, and after a lot more polish, I got the Nobusuma to move around smoothly. And it only swoops down to attack whenever it's close to the player, so it doesn't just drag itself across the ground all the time. And on day 22, I just made a grass tile set with some details and also the start of a library tile set. On day 23, I decided to lock in. It's time to finally get status effects into the game. It turns out the status effects are actually pretty similar to item effects, so maybe I should just make them both use the same base class of effects. But some of the status effects I have planned should be able to use multiple different effects that correspond to different events, so how should I account for that? Oh yeah, and I should also add that new functionality to items too. Oh no, I accidentally broke everything. And that's how I spent days 23, 24, and 25. It needed to be done, but it took forever, and I refactored the item effects and made status effects. And that together, they're called instance effects, and I had to refactor it about 1,000 times to make it actually work. But now it's a much better system that is much more expansive, and it should allow me to make any of the status effects and items that I want to. So I finished up on day 25 by making two status effects: a blaze and shield. A blaze just deals tick damage over time, while shield slows down the instance, and both of these can stack. And finally, I just added some UI for status effects. There's a canvas-based UI for the player and for future bosses, and some sprite renderer-based UI for enemies. And yeah, that's all for these first 25 days. I think that I already have a game that is more fun to play than Project Seaborn was after about 1.5 years of development, so that's good. However, it is also now way too easy that I've added all these items, as the player quickly overpowers the enemies. So I need to add some enemy leveling, and some more difficult enemies. So the next things coming are a proper store, bosses, and more items. Also, I've been thinking about names, and I'm thinking about something like Mythostrom, or a alliterative title like Myth Madness or Mytho Madness, or maybe something like Mythlike, although that's pretty basic. Any suggestions are welcome. I'm just looking for something that's simple and catchy. And one thing that I'm really trying to do with this game is pay homage to the mythological stories that it's based on. There are tons of interesting ones, and I've been reading lots of them and trying to include them in my game. So far, the items are very basic, so it's a bit harder to tie them into interesting myths. But I did link the two status effects items to some goddesses. Skemet's Curse for fire. Skemet is the Egyptian god who was called the Eye of Ra. She was the goddess who used the power of the sun to destroy enemies of the sun god, so it makes sense that her curse would be all fiery. And the second is Skadi's Vengeance. Skadi is the Norse god of winter and bow hunting, but most Norse gods are gods of hunting, so that isn't saying much. But one of the things she was known for was initially going to Asgard in order to avenge her father, before being invited to marry an Aesir god, but she had to choose based on feet. Yeah, it's a long story, but I figured that her vengeance would be pretty cold. So yeah, that's your mythology lesson for the day. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe. Bye.